The desert around Saqqara is quiet in a way that can feel almost unnatural. Wind moves across the limestone plateau, carrying dust through the broken courtyards of ruined temples and over the buried edges of causeways that once gleamed beneath the Egyptian sun. In the distance, the step-shaped silhouette of Djoser's monument still rises from the sand like a memory of the first great experiment. Farther south, at Dashur, pyramids bend and redden in the evening light. Farther north, at Giza, the largest stones of the Fourth Dynasty continue to hold their line against the horizon, stubborn and immense, as if the age that raised them never truly ended. They look eternal. That is part of their power, but the kingdom that built them is not eternal. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the world behind those monuments is beginning to fray, not in one sudden flash, not in a single invasion, not in a clean, dramatic ending that history can easily name, but through a slow weakening of the systems that once made Egypt seem almost unbreakable. For centuries, Egypt has been able to do something astonishing. It turns the annual rhythm of the Nile into grain, grain into labour, labour into stone, stone into royal eternity, and royal eternity into political order. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a machine made visible, a monument built from fields, boats, scribes, cattle, copper tools, bread, beer, rope, accounting, belief, and obedience. It is the final shining form of an entire society working in coordination. When a pyramid rises, it means the flood has come well enough. The harvest has been gathered, the granaries have filled, the workers have been fed, the quarries have delivered, the officials have recorded, the priests have performed, and the king's authority has reached from Memphis into distant fields and villages. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the mystery here is not simply why Egypt stopped building pyramids on the same scale. The deeper mystery is why a civilization that seemed so organized, so sacred, and so confident began to lose the balance that held it together. The first clue is the silence of stone itself. The pyramids remain, but they do not explain their own cost. Their smooth casing blocks are mostly gone. Their temples are broken. Their workers' settlements are fragmentary. Their administrative records survive only in scattered traces. What remains is enough to reveal greatness, but not enough to give every answer. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the story. Egypt's Old Kingdom, often called the Pyramid Age, leaves behind some of the most recognizable monuments ever built by human hands. Yet the end of that age is strangely difficult to see clearly. There is no single burned palace that marks the final hour. There is no one battlefield where the old order dies. There is no clear royal confession carved into a wall saying that the system has failed. Instead, historians and archaeologists must follow smaller signs, thinner royal resources, changing tomb styles, provincial officials growing more powerful, names of kings becoming uncertain, flood patterns possibly shifting, and later Egyptian memories of hunger, disorder, and weakened kingship. At first glance, this seems almost impossible. The Old Kingdom has already survived dynastic change, ambitious building projects, and the immense logistical burden of royal funerary cults. Its kings are not ordinary rulers in the Egyptian imagination. They stand at the center of cosmic order. The pharaoh is linked to the gods, to the sun, to the cycle that keeps the world from falling into chaos. In the royal ideology of the Pyramid Age, the king's death is not simply a political event. It is a transformation. The pyramid complex, such with its valley temple, causeway, mortuary temple, offering rooms, storage spaces, priests, and rituals, exists to carry the king into eternity and to keep his cult alive. This is religion, but it is also administration. It ties land, labor, and wealth to the memory of a dead ruler long after his body has been sealed in stone. As more kings die, more cults need maintenance, as more officials receive land, status, and local authority. More power exists outside the immediate grasp of the palace. A system built to preserve eternity also creates obligations that last beyond a single reign. The view from the plateau can be deceptive. The monuments make the Old Kingdom look like a single age of unbroken confidence. But it is a living society, and living societies change. Behind the perfect geometry of royal tombs are villages where farmers watch the river more carefully than they watch the stars. The Nile is Egypt's great gift, but it is not a machine that obeys command. A flood too low can mean fields left dry and canals strained. A flood too high can damage settlements and disturb the agricultural rhythm. The Old Kingdom depends on a narrow band of reliability. Each year's inundation must be good enough to renew the land, fill basins, support crops, and feed not only the farmers themselves but also officials, work crews, priests, craftsmen, boatmen, herders, quarrymen, and the royal household. When everything works, Egypt can appear almost miraculous. When the river disappoints repeatedly, the miracle becomes harder to maintain. Scholars still debate how much environmental stress contributed to the end of the Old Kingdom, and the debate matters because the answer changes the entire meaning of the collapse. If climate is made too large, human decisions disappear from the story. If politics is made too large, the physical world disappears, and Egypt becomes a kingdom somehow detached from the river that feeds it. The truth is almost certainly more complicated. Around the later 3rd millennium BCE, parts of the wider Near East and Northeast Africa show signs of climatic stress, aridity, shifting settlement patterns, and strain on agricultural systems. But this was not a simple worldwide disaster arriving everywhere in the same way on the same morning. It was uneven, regional, and difficult to date with perfect precision. Egypt's crisis must therefore be understood as an interaction river: harvest, storage, taxation, royal ideology, provincial ambition, administrative capacity, and memory all pressing against one another. In the final centuries of the Old Kingdom, the pyramid itself begins to change. The massive scale of Giza belongs to an earlier moment of extraordinary concentration. Later pyramids are still sacred, still royal, still meaningful, but they are generally smaller, more vulnerable, and often built with cores that do not endure as magnificently once their outer casing is stripped away. This does not mean Egypt is suddenly poor or helpless. It means the balance of expression is changing. The state can still organize labor. Kings still claim divine power. Officials still carve tombs. Priests still serve cults. But the old image of overwhelming central command is no longer as easy to sustain. The system is not collapsing visibly at every point. It is losing coherence in ways that are harder to see from a distance. And then there is the strange problem of success itself. The Old Kingdom's greatest achievements create expectations that future rulers must live under. A king who inherits the shadow of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure inherits more than monuments. He inherits a model of kingship measured in stone, scale, ritual, and control. But no state can spend forever as if it is always at its strongest. No palace can endlessly expand obligations without adjusting to the world around it. No ideology, however powerful, can fill granaries by itself. The Old Kingdom's beauty lies partly in its confidence, and its danger lies there too. It has built a vision of order so grand that any weakening of that order becomes difficult to admit. At Saqqara, the evening light softens the edges of broken walls, and the old royal landscape seems almost peaceful. But beneath that peace is a question that refuses to settle. What ended the Pyramid Age? The answer is not hidden in one tomb or one inscription. It lies scattered across river mud, desert cemeteries, administrative titles, provincial monuments, king lists, later stories, and the stubborn remains of pyramids that outlived the political world that created them. What survives in the record suggests not a civilization suddenly erased, but a state whose centre gradually loses the ability to command the whole. The stones remain high above the sand, but the living network beneath them begins to loosen, and once that loosening begins, the Pyramid Age enters its twilight, not as a failure of imagination, but as a reminder that even the most monumental societies are held together by fragile things: water, food, trust, authority, memory, and the belief that tomorrow's flood will come. Long before the Old Kingdom begins to weaken, it teaches Egypt how to imagine permanence. The land itself seems to encourage the idea. On either side of the Nile Valley, desert cliffs rise like walls. Beyond them stretches a harsher world of stone, sand, and distance. Between them lies the narrow black ribbon of cultivated soil, renewed by flood, measured by fields, crossed by canals, and watched by officials who understand that power in Egypt begins with water, but becomes real only when water is turned into grain. This is the foundation beneath every pyramid. Not the stone alone, not the king alone, not even the gods alone, but the seasonal transformation of river mud into food, food into surplus, surplus into administration, and administration into a sacred political order that can command men to quarry mountains and drag pieces of them across the floodplain. The Old Kingdom does not appear out of nothing. It grows from earlier experiments in unification, kingship, writing, taxation, and ritual power. By the time the Great Pyramid building age reaches its height, Egypt has already learned to think of itself as the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt bound together under one ruler. This union is more than geography. It is a political myth, a religious statement, and a practical administrative challenge all at once. The king wears symbols of both regions because he must be seen as the one who holds difference in balance. He's not merely a war leader or a landowner. He is the living centre of order, the human point where the divine realm, the natural world, and the social world meet. In Egyptian terms, this order is not abstract. It is visible in the flood arriving, fields producing, offerings being made, temples functioning, borders being guarded, and the dead receiving what they need. If order fails, chaos is never imagined as far away. It waits at the edge of the field, at the edge of the desert, at the edge of memory. This sacred kingship gives the Old Kingdom a force that modern eyes can easily underestimate. A pyramid is often treated as an engineering problem, and it is certainly that. But to the Egyptians who build and maintain it, the pyramid belongs to a far larger reality. It is a royal tomb, a solar symbol, a ritual landscape, and a statement that the king's transformation after death protects the continuity of the living world. The king's body is hidden, but his cult must remain active. Offerings must be delivered, priests must be supported, storerooms must be supplied, land must be assigned, records must be kept. The dead king continues to require an economy. In this way, the sacred is never separate from the administrative. Every loaf placed in a ritual setting has passed through real fields and real hands. Every symbolic act depends on a chain of labour. At the centre of this chain stands Memphis, the great administrative heart near the meeting point of the Nile Valley and the Delta. Its exact ancient appearance is difficult to reconstruct because later settlement, Nile movement, and millennia of reuse have obscured much of it, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet its importance is clear. From this region, the royal court can look both south into the long valley and north into the branching waterways of the delta. It is a natural place for a state that must connect farms, quarries, workshops, temples, and border zones. Around Memphis and its neighbouring necropolises, the royal dead create a landscape of power. Saqqara, Abusir, Dashur, and Giza are not isolated monuments scattered randomly in sand. They form a sacred and political geography, each new royal complex adding another layer to the memory of kingship. To make such a world function, Egypt needs scribes as much as stonecutters. Writing does not exist only for beautiful inscriptions. It exists for counting. It tracks cattle, fields, offerings, workers, rations, deliveries, titles, and obligations. The Old Kingdom state is not modern bureaucracy, but it is deeply administrative. Officials measure and classify the world so that it can be taxed, redistributed, and controlled. Grain is especially important because it can be stored, moved, assigned, and used to feed people who are not farming at that moment. In a society without coinage in the modern sense, grain, livestock, cloth, oil, beer, and labour obligations form the practical language of wealth. Power is not just owning land. Power is knowing who owes what, when it is due, and where it must go. The Nile flood makes this possible, but only through constant human work. Basin irrigation depends on dikes, channels, timing, and local knowledge. Fields must be marked again after inundation. Boundaries must be remembered, disputed, and recorded. The river brings fertility, but it also rearranges the landscape. The state's claim to order is therefore renewed every year in very practical ways. A good flood does not automatically create a pyramid. It creates the conditions in which a pyramid can become thinkable. Farmers produce the grain, officials assess and collect, storehouses hold reserves, work gangs receive rations, craftsmen shape tools, vessels, beams, ropes, sledges, and stone surfaces. Boat crews move materials when the river allows. Priests and royal planners place all this activity inside a cosmic frame where serving the king is also serving the order of the world. One of the lesser-known truths of the Pyramid Age is that its labour system was not simply a picture of endless misery under the whip. As older popular imagination often suggested, the reality was more complex. There were certainly hierarchies, obligations, coercion, inequality, and hard physical demands. But archaeological evidence was workers' settlements, ration systems, bones, tools, and organisation suggests skilled crews, rotating labour, provisioning medical care in some contexts, and a powerful sense of collective identity among work teams. These were not anonymous shadows alone. They were bakers, brewers, haulers, quarry workers, overseers, scribes, carpenters, sailors, potters, and stone specialists. The pyramid project required discipline, but also expertise. It required a state able to gather people, feed them, organize them, and make them part of a royal undertaking that lasted beyond any individual season. That is what makes the Old Kingdom so extraordinary and so vulnerable. Its greatness depends on coordination at a scale that must be continuously renewed. If grain collection falters, work crews cannot be supported. If officials become too independent, the palace loses reach. If floods fail, the surplus narrows. If royal cults multiply, resources are tied to the dead as well as the living. If a reign lasts too long or succession becomes uncertain, political expectation may outgrow the ability of the court to manage transition. No single weakness is enough by itself to explain the end. Scholars still debate how these pressures interacted, and the surviving evidence rarely allows simple certainty. But the very structure that makes the Old Kingdom powerful also creates many points where strain can accumulate. For now, in its strongest centuries, those strains are hidden beneath success. The king commands, the scribes record, the river rises, the fields green, the workers gather, the pyramid climbs course by course into the light. Egypt appears to have found a way to turn time into stone. Its rulers do not merely build tombs, they build a vision of the universe in which royal power, natural rhythm, and human labour are fused together. To stand before these monuments is to feel that vision still working after more than 4,000 years. Yet the permanence is misleading. The stones endure because they are no longer alive. The kingdom that raised them had to breathe each year with the Nile, negotiate each generation with its elites, and justify itself every day through food, ritual, and order. Eternity, in the Pyramid Age, is built from things that can fail. The closer one looks at a pyramid, the less it seems like a single object. From far away, it appears almost pure a triangle of stone against the sky, simple enough to recognize at a glance, impossible enough for a kingdom to spend generations explaining. But from the ground, near the broken casing blocks and the ruined temples, the illusion of simplicity disappears. A pyramid is not one thing. It is a quarry scar in the desert cliffs, a boat moving through floodwater, a scribe marking deliveries, a baker preparing bread, a rope twisted from plant fibre, a copper chisel wearing down against limestone, a jar of beer issued as rationed, and a priest counting offerings for a king already dead. The monument is the final shape, but the machine that creates it is spread across the living country. That machine begins with stone, though stone is only the most visible part. Egypt is rich in building material if a state can command the effort needed to reach it. Limestone lies near many pyramid sites, and some blocks can be quarried relatively close to the building ground. Finer white limestone for casing may come from places such as Tura, across the Nile, where the stone can be cut from cliffs and moved by boat when water conditions allow. Granite, harder and more stubborn, comes from the south near Aswan, far beyond the royal cemeteries of Memphis. Basalt, alabaster, copper, timber, and other materials enter the system from different landscapes and different chains of labour. Every choice creates a route. Every route creates a need for timing, transport, supervision, and food. The pyramid machine is not simply local. It stretches along the Nile, into the desert, and through networks of officials who must know where things are, who controls them. And when they can be moved, transport is one of the great hidden achievements of the Old Kingdom. Modern imagination often fixes on the dragging of stones across sand, but the Nile is the more important road. The river and its canals allow heavy materials to move in ways that would be nearly impossible across long dry distances. Seasonal water matters. A block that is difficult to move in 1 month may become practical in another. When flood levels bring boats closer to work zones or temporary harbours, at Giza, traces of harbour installations and settlement organisation suggest a landscape designed not just for burial, but for receiving, storing, and distributing materials on a vast scale. the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate many details of construction methods, ramp designs, labor organization, and exact sequencing. Yet the broad truth is clear enough: pyramid building required not only muscle, but timing. It required a kingdom able to use the Nile as a moving corridor of state power. The work demanded many kinds of skill. Some workers cut stone, others hauled, shaped, measured, polished, carried water, repaired tools, baked bread, brewed beer, recorded goods, and maintained the spaces where people lived while serving the project. The remains of workers' settlements near Giza have done much to change the older picture of pyramid builders as a faceless mass. They reveal planned areas, food production, administrative control, and the provisioning of a large labour forces. There is still hard inequality here, and no one should turn compulsory labour into a romantic fantasy. But the system is more organised and more humanly complex than the old myth of endless slaves under foreign whips. Work crews had names, teams could develop identity, skilled labour mattered, the machine needed bodies, but it also needed knowledge, rhythm, and experienced hands. Food is the quiet centre of everything. A stone block does not move because a king wants it to move. It moves because people have enough calories to move it, because someone has arranged bread and beer, because herds and fields have been converted into rations, because the state can gather supplies at the right place before they're needed. In the Pyramid Age, bread and beer are not casual details. They are fuel, payment, habit, and social glue. Bakeries and breweries become part of royal construction as surely as quarries and ramps. Pottery vessels, often overlooked beside monumental stone, become one of the most important traces of this daily world. A broken jar may say less to the eye than a pyramid face, but it can speak more directly about the movement of food, the scale of provisioning, and the ordinary hands that kept the royal vision alive. The royal tomb is only the centre of a larger complex. A pyramid usually belongs with temples, courtyards, satellite structures, boat pits, causeways, enclosure walls, magazines, and cemeteries of officials nearby. The king's afterlife needs a permanent ritual economy. Offerings must continue after burial. Priests must be assigned. Lands may be attached to cult foundations. Goods must flow toward a dead king whose pyramid remains a living institution. This is one of the strange strengths of the Old Kingdom. It makes death administratively productive. The tomb organizes labor, wealth, land, and belief, but it also creates a long tail of obligation. The more royal and elite cults accumulate, the more resources are tied to maintaining memory. No single pyramid bankrupts Egypt. That would be too simple. But over time, the sacred landscape becomes crowded with claims on land, labour, and produce. And those claims must be balanced against living rule. Bureaucracy gives the machine its nerves. Titles multiply. Overseers supervise other overseers. Scribes track goods that move from estate to storehouse, from storehouse to work crew, from field to temple. Officials rise through proximity to the king, but many also root themselves in provinces where land, family, and local status matter. In the strongest phases of the Old Kingdom, this is an advantage. The centre cannot personally manage every canal, herd, and workshop, so it depends on delegated authority. Local elites make the royal state visible in distant places. They collect, organize, judge, and report. They are the fingers of Memphis reaching into the country, but fingers can learn their own strength. When the centre is rich and commanding, delegation looks like efficiency. When the centre weakens, the same delegation can become independence. The pyramid machine also depends on confidence. It assumes that the king's command will be obeyed, that officials will deliver, that stores will fill, that the Nile will remain within a workable range, and that future reigns will continue supporting what past reigns established. This confidence is not foolish. For generations it is justified. Egypt does build. It does feed workforces. It does quarry, haul, carve, inscribe, bury, and remember. But the machine has very little room for repeated disruption. A poor flood can be survived if stores are strong and administration holds. A succession problem can be managed if elites remain loyal and resources flow. A costly cult can continue if harvests are reliable. Yet when several pressures overlap, the same system that once looked magnificent begins to show its dependence on conditions no king can fully control. That's why the pyramids are such dangerous witnesses. They tell the truth about Old Kingdom power, but only part of it. They show what Egypt could do when environment, belief, administration, and labor aligned. They do not show how fragile that alignment could become. Standing before them, it is easy to think first of stone. The ancient state thought in stone too, but it lived in grain, mud, ink, rope, cattle, floodwater, and trust. The pyramid machine was an astonishing system. Its success made Egypt appear timeless, yet inside that success were the very conditions that would make crisis so difficult to absorb. A machine spread across an entire kingdom can build eternity only while the kingdom itself still holds together. By the time the reign of Pepi II comes into view, the Old Kingdom has already become an ancient structure in its own right. It has memories behind it. It has traditions hardened by repetition. It has royal cemeteries stretching across the Memphite landscape. Generations of officials buried near the kings they served, and a political language so familiar that it can almost seem automatic. A king dies, another king rises, rituals continue, titles are granted, estates function, offerings are made, and the great body of Egypt moves forward under the sign of divine rule. Yet history often becomes most dangerous when institutions appear to know exactly what they are doing. Repetition can hide weakness. Ceremony can cover uncertainty. A state may continue to speak in the old confident voice long after the conditions that created that confidence have begun to change. Pepi II stands near the end of the 6th dynasty, and his reign has long fascinated scholars because ancient tradition gives him an extraordinarily long rule. Later sources suggest that he may have reigned for more than 90 years, a number so striking that it has become almost inseparable from the story of Old Kingdom decline. Modern scholars still debate the exact length of his reign, and the evidence remains difficult. Egyptian king lists, later traditions, and scattered contemporary records do not fit together as neatly as one might wish. But even if the highest number is treated with caution, Pepi II's reign was almost certainly long enough to shape the political landscape deeply. A very long reign can create stability, but it can also freeze a system in place. It can allow officials to build local power over decades. It can delay succession until the next generation of royal claimants is old, divided, or politically untested. It can make the court feel permanent, while quietly making the moment after the king's death more fragile. There is something almost haunting about that possibility. In the ideology of the Old Kingdom, the king is the living anchor of order. He is not supposed to be merely a temporary manager of government. He is the point through which cosmic balance touches the land. A long-lived king should therefore appear as a blessing, proof that divine favour endures. The longer he sits on the throne, the longer the rituals remain stable. the longer officials know whose name they serve. The longer royal commands flow from an established centre. But human institutions are not the same as sacred images. Around an aging monarch, networks of influence can thicken. Courtiers compete for access. Provincial families strengthen their local bases. Offices pass through households. The centre may remain symbolically supreme, while becoming practically more dependent on men whose wealth and status lie far from the palace. Pepi II's pyramid at South Saqqara reflects both continuity and change. It belongs to the long royal tradition of pyramid complexes, with a mortuary temple, causeway, valley temple, and the ritual architecture expected of a king who must live eternally after death. It is not the giant experiment of Khufu's age, but it is not meaningless or poor. It shows that the royal state can still mobilize resources, still build in sacred form, still surround the king with the architecture of divine transformation. Inside the pyramids of the later 5th and 6th dynasties, the pyramid texts appear, spells and ritual utterances carved to guide the king into the afterlife. This is one of the great developments of the period. The interior of royal tombs becomes filled not only with stone, but with written sacred power. In a way, as the physical scale of pyramids declines from the great age of Giza, the textual and ritual interior becomes more elaborate. Royal eternity is no longer expressed only by mass. It is also inscribed in language. That shift should not be misunderstood as simple decline. Smaller pyramids do not automatically mean a collapsing civilization. Religious ideas change, architectural priorities change, administrative choices change, yet the contrast is still meaningful. The Old Kingdom is no longer expressing royal power through the same overwhelming concentration of stone seen in the 4th dynasty. The late Pyramid age is more complex, more bureaucratic, more textually rich, and perhaps more distributed. The king remains central, but he is surrounded by an increasingly visible elite world. High officials build decorated tombs with autobiographical inscriptions that celebrate their service, virtues, and local achievements. These inscriptions are carefully shaped, not transparent diaries, but they reveal a society in which non-royal men can present themselves with growing confidence. They want to be remembered not only as servants of a king, but as powerful figures in their own right. This matters because the Old Kingdom is not only a monarchy, it is a monarchy mediated through officials. The king's will must travel through men who know the provinces, manage labour, supervise fields, control storehouses, and maintain networks of dependents. In earlier moments, the court can absorb these elites into a royal system that enhances the king's glory. In later moments, the same elites may become harder to contain. Provincial governors, often called nomarchs in modern writing, develop strong local identities. Their tombs appear in regional cemeteries rather than only near the royal residence. Their inscriptions emphasize feeding people, administering justice, maintaining order, and caring for their communities. Some of this language is idealized. Egyptian tomb autobiography is not a neutral report, but what survives in the record suggests that provincial authority is becoming more prominent, and that local power is no longer merely a shadow cast by Memphis. The long reign of Pepi II may have intensified this trend. If a king rules for many decades, officials can spend entire careers under one royal name. Sons can inherit positions from fathers. Local families can deepen their claims to office. The palace may rely on them because replacing them would risk disruption. Meanwhile, the expected rhythm of royal renewal is delayed. In a system where each new king reasserts central control, appoints loyal men, rewards supporters, and rebalances factions. An unusually long reign can create a strange stillness. It is stable on the surface, but beneath it pressures accumulate. When the king finally dies, the court may not simply pass smoothly into a new era. It may have to confront decades of deferred rivalry all at once. Still, it would be too easy to blame Pepi II personally for the fall of the Old Kingdom. That is the kind of tidy explanation history often tempts people to accept an old king, a tired court, a kingdom falling asleep under the weight of one reign. But no single life, however long, fully accounts for this. The evidence remains incomplete, and the end of the Old Kingdom cannot be reduced to royal age alone. Climate stress, administrative decentralization, economic obligations, succession uncertainty, and regional power all matter. Pepi II's reign is important not because it magically breaks Egypt, but because it may have allowed existing weaknesses to grow under a surface of continuity. The state does not fall while looking obviously broken. It weakens while still speaking the language of eternity. That is the unsettling lesson of this moment. The late 6th dynasty does not look like a simple ruin from the beginning. Kings still rule, temples still receive offerings, pyramids are still built, officials still carve confident lives into stone. The machinery of the Old Kingdom continues to move, but its rhythm is changing. Royal power is still sacred, yet it must negotiate more heavily with men outside the immediate centre. The pyramid remains a sign of eternal kingship. Yet its world is increasingly crowded by local ambitions and long-term obligations. The Nile still flows, yet its future reliability cannot be commanded. Pepi II's long reign becomes a corridor between greatness and uncertainty, a period in which the old order survives long enough to appear safe, while the forces that will outlive it gather strength in the provinces, in the granaries, in the tombs of officials, and in the silence that follows a king who has ruled for almost longer than memory can comfortably hold. Power does not always leave a palace loudly. Sometimes it walks out through ordinary doors, carried by officials who still use royal titles, still honour the king, still present themselves as faithful servants, yet begin to build lives that no longer depend entirely on the court. In the Old Kingdom, this movement is written across the landscape in tombs, inscriptions, provincial cemeteries, and the geography of memory. The centre at Memphis does not vanish. The king does not suddenly become irrelevant, but the balance between centre and province begins to alter. Authority that once seemed to flow downward from the palace now gathers weight in local places, among families whose influence is rooted in nomes, fields, temples, and regional networks. The shift is gradual enough that no one living through it may think of it as the end of an age, yet from a distance it becomes one of the clearest signs that the pyramid world is changing. Egypt is not a single uniform plain governed easily by command. It is a long river country, stretched for hundreds of miles between desert edges, divided into districts that modern scholars usually call nomes. Each nome has its own fields, canals, settlements, cult places, storage needs, and local elite families. The king's authority gives the land a sacred unity, but practical government depends on people who know these places intimately. A royal order issued near Memphis has to become a harvest assessment in Middle Egypt, a canal repair in the south, a shipment of cattle, a delivery of stone or grain, a judgment in a local dispute. No king, however divine in ideology, can personally watch every field. So the Old Kingdom needs intermediaries. It needs governors, overseers, scribes, priests, estate managers, and men who can translate royal power into local action. For much of the Pyramid Age, this arrangement strengthens the state. Local officials are not necessarily enemies of the crown. They are the crown's instruments. They collect taxes, organize labor, supervise expeditions, maintain order, and make the king visible far from the royal residence. Their prestige depends on royal favor. Their titles announce service. Their careers often rise through court connections. Many still look toward Memphis in the royal necropolis as the center of honor. But over time, the record begins to show a stronger local face. Officials are buried not only near the king, but increasingly in their own regions. Their tombs become statements of rooted authority. Their inscriptions speak of feeding their people, protecting their districts, managing resources, and being beloved locally. These claims are idealized, of course. Tombs present the dead in the best possible light. Still, the pattern matters. A man who chooses to be remembered in his province is making a statement about where his power lives. The tombs of provincial elites are among the most revealing witnesses of this shift. At places such as Aswan, Mir, Kubet el Hawa, Deir el Gebrawi, and other regional cemeteries, the walls and facades of tombs preserve a world that is not simply royal. Here, the dead official is shown with his estates, scribes, boats, animals, offering bearers, and symbols of a local status. The art is often less famous than the Great Pyramids, but in some ways it is more intimate. It shows the structure of power outside the royal court. It shows that wealth can be organized locally, that memory can be anchored in provincial cliffs, that an official's identity can be tied to a district as much as to the distant king. A lesser-known detail is that some provincial autobiographies emphasize the official's role in sustaining communities during difficult times, especially by providing food or maintaining order. These texts must be read carefully, because self-praise is not neutral evidence, but they reveal what virtues local power wanted to claim. As provincial authority grows more visible, the Old Kingdom faces a delicate problem. The state needs strong local officials to function, but strong local officials can become semi-independent if the center loses its ability to reward, discipline, or replace them. A governor who controls access to grain, labor, and local institutions can become indispensable. His family may hold office for generations. His tomb may dominate the local cemetery. His connections with priests, scribes, and estate workers may be stronger in daily life than any distant command from Memphis. This does not mean he declares rebellion at once. Most power does not begin as open defiance. It begins as dependence reversed. The palace depends on the province more than the province depends on the palace. The growth of local authority also changes how royal ideology feels on the ground. In the great age of centralized pyramid building, the king's monument absorbs the labor and imagination of the country into one overwhelming sacred focus. In the later Old Kingdom, elite tombs and local cult landscapes multiply the places where status is displayed. The royal pyramid remains important, but it is no longer the only stage on which eternity is performed. Officials seek their own afterlives with increasing elaboration. They carve their virtues into stone. They show estates bringing produce. They display the order they claim to have created. The language of order, once concentrated around the king, becomes part of provincial self-presentation. This is not necessarily a collapse of belief. It may be a redistribution of sacred and social confidence. Memphis, meanwhile, still matters immensely. It would be wrong to imagine a clean break, as if the provinces simply detach while the capital sleeps. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the pace, scale, and causes of decentralization. Some changes may reflect administrative adaptation rather than weakness. The Crown may have deliberately empowered local officials to manage distant regions more efficiently. Certain titles may shift in meaning over time. Tomb location may reflect family strategy, religious preference, economic opportunity, or changing court politics, yet the overall direction is difficult to ignore. By the late Old Kingdom, the provinces speak more loudly in the archaeological record. The map of power becomes less sharply focused on the royal centre. This matters especially because the Old Kingdom's wealth is agricultural wealth. Control over land and produces control over life. When harvests are strong, redistribution can bind the country together. The palace can feed workers, maintain cults, reward officials, and display abundance. But if environmental stress narrows the surplus, local control becomes more important. The official who can open a granary, organize a canal, or distribute stored food in a district may become the person people experience as powerful. The king remains cosmic, but hunger is local, administration is local, survival is local. No single explanation fully accounts for this transition, but it is easy to see how weak floods, rising obligations, and entrenched provincial families could combine to reduce the practical reach of Memphis. By the time royal power begins to falter more openly, the provinces are not empty spaces waiting for instruction. They are organized, ambitious, and capable of surviving in ways the central court may not fully control. This is why the fall of the Pyramid Age is not simply the fall of a palace. It is the transformation of a whole political landscape. Power does not disappear from Egypt. It changes address. It moves into provincial tombs, local lineages, district storehouses, and the hands of officials who can still speak the language of loyalty while living in a world increasingly shaped by their own authority. The palace remains sacred, but its shadow grows shorter. Beyond Memphis, the gnomes are learning that they too can hold the weight of Egypt. The Nile is so central to Egypt that it can almost disappear from the story. Like air from a room, it is always there, assumed, praised, measured, feared, and depended upon, yet only when it fails does its true power become visible. For the builders of the Pyramid Age, the river is not scenery. It is the country's spine, calendar, road, field maker, tax base, and sacred pulse. Every year, the inundation rises from rains far to the south, spreads across the valley floor, leaves behind fertile silt, and withdraws into channels and basins where farmers can begin the work of planting. When the flood behaves within a useful range, Egypt feels blessed by order. When it does not, order itself begins to seem fragile. The later Old Kingdom appears to have lived through a period when that reliability may have been tested. Around the late 3rd millennium BCE, many regions of the eastern Mediterranean, Western Asia, and northeast Africa show signs of environmental stress, aridity, or disruption. Archaeologists and climate scientists often discuss this broad period under the label of the 4.2 kiloyear event, a term that points to climate disturbances around 2200 BCE. But the label can be misleading if it is treated as one single global catastrophe. Recent scholarship is increasingly careful about this. The evidence does not show one identical disaster striking every civilization in the same way. Different regions experience different patterns, at different speeds, with different social consequences. In Egypt, the question is not whether climate magically destroyed the Old Kingdom, But whether repeated low Nile floods and wider aridity place dangerous pressure on a state already carrying political and economic strain, to understand why even a modest shift could matter, it helps to imagine the Nile not as a river in a modern sense, controlled by dams and gauges, but as a living annual uncertainty. Ancient Egypt watches the flood with intense attention because too little water can shrink the cultivated zone, reduce yields, and make canals harder to manage. A low inundation does not simply mean less beauty in the fields, it means less grain in storage, fewer resources for redistribution, weaker support for labour crews, strain on temple offerings, pressure on local officials, and anxiety among communities whose survival depends on the harvest. Egypt has tools for resilient storage, administration, regional variation, local adaptation, and long experience with flood variability. But resilience has limits. A bad year can be endured. Several bad years, especially if they arrive in a society already politically stretched, can change the meaning of kingship itself. The Old Kingdom king is supposed to uphold order, but he cannot command the rains in the Ethiopian highlands or the complex climate systems that feed the Nile. This creates a dangerous gap between ideology and ecology. When the river rises well, the king's sacred role appears confirmed. When the river fails repeatedly, the people may not think in modern scientific terms, but the symbolic connection between ruler and cosmic balance becomes harder to sustain. The king's power is not judged only in ceremonies, it is judged in full granaries, stable fields, functioning canals, reliable offerings, and the visible ability of the state to prevent disorder. The flood is therefore both environmental fact and political test. The evidence for late Old Kingdom environmental stress comes in many forms, none of them perfect on its own. Researchers study Nile sediments, ancient lake records, pollen, dust deposits, cave formations, archaeological settlement patterns, textual hints, and later memories of famine. Some records suggest increased aridity or reduced Nile flow in the centuries around the end of the Old Kingdom. Other evidence is harder to align precisely with dynastic chronology. Dating remains a challenge, especially when trying to connect a climate signal from one region to a political event in another. Scholars still debate the timing, strength, and social impact of these changes. Yet what survives in the record suggests that environmental pressure cannot be dismissed. The river may not have been the only cause of the Old Kingdom's weakening, but it may have been the pressure that made other weaknesses harder to hide. There is a quiet brutality in low water. It does not need to topple walls. It does not need an army. It enters the world through calculations: fewer sacks of grain, fewer animals fed, fewer workers supported, fewer offerings delivered, fewer favours granted, fewer margins for error. It changes what officials can promise. It changes what villages expect from the state. It changes the relationship between local storehouses and royal demands. A pyramid-building government depends on surplus. But surplus is not an abstract concept. It is the difference between enough and not enough after seed grain. Local consumption, taxes, ritual obligations, and emergency reserves have all been considered. If that difference narrows, the great machine of the Pyramid Age begins to compete with the needs that keep it alive. This is where climate and decentralization meet. A strong central state can sometimes absorb environmental shocks by moving resources from regions of surplus to regions of shortage. But that requires accurate information, loyal officials, transport capacity, and trust that the centre will redistribute fairly or at least effectively. If provincial authorities have grown stronger, and if local elites control more of the practical mechanisms of storage and distribution, A low flood may strengthen local power even more. A governor who can feed his district during a difficult year becomes indispensable. A palace that demands grain but cannot guarantee protection or relief begins to look distant. The Nile's failure, therefore, does not simply reduce food, it may rearrange authority. Later Egyptian texts preserve memories of disorder, hunger, and a world turned upside down, although they must be handled with caution. They are not straightforward newspapers from the collapse itself. Some were composed later, shaped by literary convention, royal ideology, and the desire to contrast chaos with restored order. Still, such memories may preserve the emotional truth of crisis, even when the details are stylized. Ancient societies often remember environmental stress through moral and political language. A failed flood becomes not only a hydrological event, but a sign that the world has lost balance. Famine becomes a memory of failed rule. Disorder becomes the shadow against which later kings present themselves as saviors. The surprise is that Egypt does not simply end. Even if the Nile's behavior worsens, communities adapt. People shift expectations, rely on local networks, adjust cultivation where possible, and turn toward authorities who can act nearby. This is important because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. The end of the Old Kingdom is not a Hollywood image of everyone vanishing into sand. The land remains inhabited, the river still flows, even if badly or irregularly. Farmers still farm. Priests still perform rites, officials still carve inscriptions. Life continues, but the structure holding that life together changes. The state that once transformed Nile abundance into pyramid eternity now struggles to keep its center strong in a world of narrower margins. At the edge of the cultivated land where green fields meet desert, the meaning of the Old Kingdom's crisis becomes clearest. Egypt's monuments were built from confidence in recurrence. The flood will return. Grain will grow. Workers will be fed. Kings will become eternal. And order will renew itself. But nature does not owe any civilization a stable pattern forever. The Nile begins to fail not necessarily as one dramatic catastrophe, but as a series of stresses that expose the limits of royal power. The Pyramid Age has always rested on water. When that water becomes uncertain, stone still stands, but the living system beneath it begins to tremble. When the Nile flood is generous, grain can seem almost ordinary. It lies in baskets, jars, granaries, storerooms, temple magazines, workers' rations, and offering tables. It becomes bread, beer, seed, tax, wage, gift, and ritual promise. It passes through hands so constantly that its power can be hidden by familiarity. Yet in the Old Kingdom, grain is one of the deepest forms of authority. Whoever can measure it, store it, move it, protect it, and distribute it, holds more than food. They hold time, they hold labor, they hold loyalty, they hold the ability to make tomorrow possible. This is why a weak flood is never just an agricultural problem. It enters the kingdom through the stomach, but it travels quickly into politics. A lower inundation may leave some fields thirsty or reduce the area that can be reliably cultivated. The harvest shrinks. The amount kept for seed must still be protected. The amount needed by farming households cannot simply disappear. Animals must still be fed or managed. Temples still expect offerings. Officials still expect deliveries. Work crews still require rations. The palace still has obligations, and the dead kings still have cults that demand support. In a year of abundance, these claims may coexist. In a year of shortage, they begin to compete. The Old Kingdom depends on redistribution, but redistribution is not a gentle word. It means collection as well as giving. It means scribes assessing fields, officials recording obligations, storehouses receiving produce, and people surrendering part of what they have grown into a larger system that promises order in return. When that system works, it can protect society from local variation. Grain from one district can support another need. Royal projects can be fed. Priestly service can continue. Officials can be rewarded. The king appears not merely as a taker, but as the center through which abundance is organized. When the system strains, however, the same mechanisms may feel very different. A tax that is tolerable in good years can become bitter in bad ones. A demand from the center can appear distant from local reality. A granary can be a symbol of safety or a symbol of power withheld. Ancient Egypt's administrative mind is beautifully practical in this regard. It measures, counts, seals, stores, and labels. A granary is not simply a pile of grain indoors. It is an institution. It must be built, guarded, filled, emptied, checked, and connected to records. Scribes turn harvest into numbers, and numbers into decisions. This is one of the less dramatic but more important foundations of the Pyramid Age. The royal state can command stone because it first commands accounting. Without records, there's no reliable way to organize large labor forces, long-distance transport, temple offerings, or emergency reserves. The greatness of the pyramids rests partly on ink, clay ceilings, wooden tags, and men trained to make the world legible to authority. But numbers can also reveal weakness. When less grain enters the system, the shortage does not remain vague for long. It appears in accounts, ration lists, delayed deliveries, reduced allocations, and difficult choices. The court may have to decide whether to maintain a royal project, support a funerary cult, reward an official, supply an expedition, or preserve reserves. Local officials may have to decide how much to send upward and how much to keep near home. Priests may face reduced offerings, workers may receive less or wait longer. Farmers may resist demands, not necessarily through rebellion, but through concealment, delay, negotiation, or dependence on local patrons who can shield them. The evidence remains incomplete, and daily tensions rarely leave clear records, but the logic of the system makes the pressure visible. In such a world, hunger is not only a physical condition, it is a political language. Later Egyptian inscriptions from officials often boast that they fed people in difficult times or prevented suffering in their districts. These claims are shaped by ideals of virtue and should not be read as plain statistical reports. Still, they show what kind of action carried moral weight. To feed others was to prove that one possessed legitimate authority. A ruler, whether royal or local, had to be seen as a provider. In a stable old kingdom, the king is the supreme provider, the one whose order makes all provision possible. But when scarcity sharpens, people may look first to the person who can actually open a storehouse nearby. This is one of the quiet ways local power grows. A nomarch or provincial elite does not need to reject the king to become more important than the king in daily experience. He only needs to control the grain that matters at the moment of need. His storehouses, his estate networks, his scribes, his boats, his dependents, and his local reputation can bind communities to him. If he can keep canals functioning, organize labor, maintain cults, and distribute food, his authority becomes practical before it becomes ideological. Royal power remains sacred, but sacred distance is not the same as bread. The more uncertain the Nile becomes, the more valuable local control over resources becomes. The burden of older royal greatness also presses into this grain economy. Every pyramid complex is not only a completed monument, but a continuing appetite. Funerary cults require offerings, personnel, lands, and management. Elite tombs have their own needs as well. The dead are part of the economy of the living. In Egyptian thought, this is not wasteful in a modern sense. It is necessary, sacred, and deeply tied to order. But from the viewpoint of resources, it creates enduring claims. The Old Kingdom does not simply pay for one king at a time. It inherits past kings. It maintains memory. It feeds eternity. In good conditions, this continuity strengthens the state. Under pressure, it adds weight. No single explanation fully accounts for the weakening that follows. Grain shortages alone do not automatically break a kingdom. Egypt has known bad floods before and would know them again. What matters is the combination of stress and structure. A centralized monarchy with strong reserves, flexible administration, and loyal local officials can survive much. A monarchy already facing entrenched provincial authority, long-term cult obligations, uncertain succession, and possible low Nile floods has less room to maneuver. Scarcity does not invent every problem. It reveals which problems have been growing quietly. The fragile bond between ruler and people is therefore not sentimental, it is material. The king's cosmic role must be made real in fields and granaries. If the Nile rises, if the crops grow, if the storehouses fill, if redistribution works, the ideology of order feels confirmed by daily life. If the flood disappoints and the state cannot respond convincingly, the same ideology becomes vulnerable. People may still honor the king, they may still believe in the old forms, but loyalty can thin when survival depends more on local arrangements than royal command. In the fading pyramid age, grain becomes a test no monument can avoid. The stones at Giza still proclaim a world of divine confidence. The texts in later pyramids still promise royal ascent among the gods. Officials still carve themselves as righteous guardians of order. Yet below these declarations lies the older, simpler fact that Egypt must eat. The fall of the Old Kingdom begins to look less like the destruction of a palace and more like the narrowing of a surplus. The pyramid machine does not stop because Egyptians forget how to build. It weakens because the resources, trust, and administrative reach that once made such building possible become harder to hold together. In the end, the power of grain is the power to sustain belief. When grain falters, belief does not vanish overnight, but it becomes heavier to carry. The trouble at the end of the Old Kingdom does not speak with one clear voice. It does not leave behind a single official account explaining what went wrong, sealed in a royal archive and waiting patiently for modern scholars. Instead, it murmurs through fragments. It appears in tomb inscriptions that praise local officials for generosity. It appears in changing burial landscapes. It appears in the uncertain order of kings after the 6th dynasty. It appears in later literary works that remember a world of hunger, confusion, and overturned order, though those works are shaped by imagination, ideology, and the politics of later times. To listen to this troubled age, one has to accept that the record is both revealing and evasive. It tells enough to make crisis visible, but not enough to make crisis simple. The most immediate voices come from the tombs of officials. These texts are not diaries. They're not neutral reports written for future historians. They're carefully composed self-presentations, designed to preserve status, virtue, and memory after death. An official wants to be remembered as just effective, loyal, generous, and favored. He wants his name to endure. He wants offerings to continue. He wants the living to see him as someone who upheld order. Because of this, every claim must be handled with caution. When an inscription says a man fed the hungry, protected his district, or acted when others struggled, it is not automatically a factual report of a specific famine. It may be a formula of moral excellence, yet formulas become popular for reasons. They reveal what a society values, what anxieties it recognizes, and what kinds of behavior are worth boasting about. In the late Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period, some provincial autobiographies place unusual emphasis on local care, food provision, and leadership during hardship. These are quiet but important clues. They suggest that local officials are not merely administrators of royal commands. They are presenting themselves as guardians of life in their own communities. The language of provision becomes a language of legitimacy. A man does not only say that he served the king, he says, in effect, that he maintained order where he lived. He fed, organized, protected, judged, and sustained. What survives in the record suggests that the moral center of power is widening. The king remains sacred, but the local official increasingly claims the virtues once associated with royal care. This shift can be seen not only in words, but in place. Tombs are arguments made in stone. Their location, size, decoration, and inscriptions all say something about where a person expects memory to gather. In earlier Old Kingdom patterns, the royal court and Memphite cemeteries dominate elite aspiration. To be near the king in death is to remain close to the source of power. Over time, more provincial elites choose or emphasize burial in their own regions. Their tombs look out over local landscapes rather than only toward the royal necropolis. This does not mean they reject the king. Egyptian identity is rarely that blunt. But it does mean the provinces are becoming stronger stages for elite memory. The political map is being redrawn through the geography of burial. Some of the evidence is administrative rather than literary. Titles change. Offices appear in new patterns. The careers of officials suggest a growing importance of provincial administration. Royal inscriptions become less abundant or less commanding in certain periods. Later king lists preserve confusing sequences after Pepi II, with short reigns, uncertain names, and dynastic shadows that are difficult to arrange. The South Saqqara stone, the Turin canon, and other later sources offer pieces of chronology, but they are damaged, selective, or separated from the events by time. Scholars still debate how many kings ruled, how long they ruled, and how far their authority extended. This uncertainty itself is telling. A period that once presented kingship as eternal clarity becomes, in retrospect, a blur of names and broken succession. Then there are the famous literary memories of disorder, texts from later periods, such as works often associated with social upheaval and lamentation, describe a world turned upside down, poor and rich changing places, officials losing authority, temples neglected, violence and fear spreading, and the land no longer behaving as it should. These writings are powerful, but they are dangerous if read too literally. Many were copied or composed after the Old Kingdom had already ended. They use literary conventions. They may exaggerate chaos in order to celebrate the restoration of order under later kings. They are not straightforward eyewitness accounts from the streets of Memphis, yet it would also be a mistake to dismiss them completely. They preserve the shape of Egyptian fear. They show what collapse meant in the Egyptian imagination, not only political fragmentation, but the failure of the world's moral structure. In these texts, disorder is often described as inversion. What should be high becomes low. What should be secure becomes uncertain. What should be abundant becomes empty. This is not just dramatic language. It reflects a worldview in which society, nature, and kingship are interwoven. A failed harvest, a weakened ruler, a looted tomb, a silent temple, and a broken social hierarchy are all signs of the same deeper danger, the weakening of order itself. The Egyptian concept of proper balance is not merely philosophical. It is lived through the river, the court, the family, the field, the temple, and the tomb. When later writers imagine collapse, they imagine a world where these bonds loosen at once. Archaeology adds another kind of voice, one without grammar, pottery styles, settlement remains, burial goods, tomb architecture, ceilings, and evidence of local production can reveal continuities and disruptions that texts do not explain. Sometimes the material record complicates the written memory of collapse. In some regions, life seems to continue with adaptation rather than total breakdown. Local workshops still produce goods, cemeteries remain active, officials still commission tombs, cults still function in some form. This matters because it pushes against the old idea that the first intermediate period was simply a dark age of universal misery. The collapse of central power is not the same as the collapse of all society. Some communities may suffer greatly, others may adjust. Some elites may lose access to royal favour, others may gain power precisely because the centre is weaker. The silence of ordinary people remains one of the deepest limits in the evidence. Farmers, herders, craft workers, boatmen, and labourers rarely speak directly in surviving texts. Their lives are usually visible through what officials counted, built, buried, or claimed. This creates a distorted view. The fall of the Old Kingdom is often seen through kings and elites because those are the people most likely to leave inscriptions and monuments. Yet the real consequences of low floods, shrinking surplus, and administrative strain would have been felt most constantly in ordinary households and local work routines. The evidence remains incomplete, and the people who carried the heaviest burdens are often the least audible. Still, the fragments together form a pattern, a more vocal provincial elite, a royal chronology that becomes uncertain, literary memories of hunger and inversion, archaeological signs of regional variation, a sacred centre that no longer dominates the record as completely as before. None of these alone proves a single cause. Together, they suggest a kingdom whose old language of power no longer matches its political reality. The voices from this troubled age do not tell one clean story, but they do not sound like silence either. They sound like a society trying to explain why the order that once seemed carved into stone has become something more fragile, local, and contested. And perhaps that is why the end of the Pyramid Age remains so compelling. The monuments make Egypt look certain, but the evidence around them is full of uncertainty. The stones speak of eternity, the inscriptions speak of virtue, the later stories speak of fear, the archaeology speaks of adaptation. Between them lies the real history, not one dramatic collapse, but a long argument between memory and survival, between what the kingdom claimed to be and what the land, the river, and its people could still sustain. The end of the Old Kingdom is tempting to imagine as a scene, a palace abandoned, a granary broken open, a royal name forgotten, a final command sent from Memphis and ignored somewhere far upriver. History often invites the mind toward such images because they give collapse a shape. They make it visible, almost theatrical. But the Pyramid Age does not appear to have ended in one clean moment. There is no single hour when Egypt stops being the world of the Old Kingdom and becomes something else. The change is slower, more uneven, and more unsettling. It is the kind of transformation that may be hard to recognize while it is happening, because so much continues. Kings still claim power, officials still hold titles, tombs are still made, fields are still cultivated, offerings are still imagined. Yet the structure connecting these things begins to lose its old force. A collapse without one moment is harder to tell, but it is closer to how many ancient states actually weaken. Institutions rarely fail everywhere at once. They lose capacity in layers. First, a demand takes longer to answer. Then an official keeps more authority for himself. Then a local tomb speaks more proudly than before. Then a bad flood exposes the shortage of reserves. Then royal succession becomes uncertain. Then the centre still exists. But its commands travel through a country less willing, or less able, to obey as it once did. None of these changes by itself needs to look like the end of an age. Together, they create a world in which the old system remains visible but no longer works with the same confidence. This is why the search for one main cause can become misleading. Climate stress matters, but climate alone does not fully explain the end of the Old Kingdom. Low Nile floods may have reduced harvests, narrowed surplus, and placed pressure on redistribution. Yet Egypt had endured difficult years before. Political decentralization matters, but decentralization alone does not explain everything either. Local elites could strengthen the kingdom when they acted as loyal agents of the crown. Economic obligations matter, especially the long-term cost of funerary cults, temples, estates, and administrative networks. But no account book survives that simply declares the pyramid economy exhausted. Succession problems matter, especially after long reigns and short-lived kings. But dynastic uncertainty becomes dangerous, partly because other pressures already exist. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The Old Kingdom weakens because several forms of strain converge. The key is interaction. A low flood is serious in any agricultural society, but it becomes more dangerous if the central administration has already lost some reach. A powerful provincial governor is manageable when the king can reward, replace, or restrain him. But he becomes more independent when local grain stores matter more than royal favour. A royal funerary cult is a sacred duty in prosperous times, but it becomes a heavier claim when harvests shrink. A long reign can be stable, but it can also allow officials to entrench themselves and make succession more delicate. A later king can inherit not only a throne, but an entire backlog of unresolved tensions. Collapse, in this sense, is not an event. It is a loss of flexibility. The Old Kingdom's ideology may have made that loss especially dangerous. Royal power is built on the promise of order. The king stands at the centre of the world not merely as a ruler, but as a guarantor that the forces of life remain properly aligned. When the system works, this ideology is powerful because daily experience confirms it. The river rises, grain grows, taxes are collected, workers are fed, offerings are made, and the king's pyramid rises toward the sky. But when the same system struggles, ideology becomes a test it cannot easily pass. If the river fails, if grain is scarce, if local officials appear more effective than the palace, the sacred image of kingship does not vanish immediately. It becomes strained. People may still believe in order, but they may experience that order less through Memphis and more through local power. There is a kind of quiet irony here. The Old Kingdom built its greatest monuments to defeat time, yet time was one of the forces working against it. Every generation added obligations. More royal cults required support. More elite families expected status. More land became tied to institutions. More offices developed traditions and interests. A state that once expanded its power through organization could find itself increasingly bound by the very organization it created. The Pyramid Age did not simply spend resources on stone and then collapse. That is too crude. Rather, its sacred economy created a dense network of claims that had to be maintained year after year. Under stable conditions, this network displayed continuity. Under stress, it reduced room for maneuver. The unevenness of the evidence matches this kind of decline. If Egypt had been destroyed suddenly by invasion or a single cataclysm, the archaeological record might show a sharper break. Instead, it shows variation. Some places reveal weakening connections to the royal centre. Some provincial elites become more prominent. Some traditions continue. Some later memories exaggerate disorder. While local evidence suggests adaptation, the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the pace of change from region to region. But this unevenness is not a problem to be explained away. It may be exactly what collapse looked like. The centre weakened, while local life continued in altered forms. A useful way to imagine the Old Kingdom's end is not as a building knocked down, but as a great rope slowly fraying. For a long time, the rope still holds. Strands break without the whole structure giving way. The king remains, the titles remain, the rituals remain. The river still flows, though not always generously. The provinces still send signals of loyalty, though their own authority grows. Then, at some point, the rope no longer bears the same weight. The state cannot pull the country together as it once did. What had been stress becomes separation. What had been local prestige becomes local power. What had been a royal order becomes a negotiation. This also explains why later Egyptians could remember the period as one of disorder, even if life did not collapse everywhere. From the perspective of royal ideology, the loss of unified kingship was itself a profound crisis. Egypt was supposed to be held together. The two lands were supposed to be balanced under one ruler. A divided political landscape felt like a wound in the cosmic order. Later rulers had every reason to portray the preceding disorder as dark, because their own legitimacy depended on claiming that they restored light. But beneath the propaganda may lie a real historical experience uncertainty, regional rivalry, strained resources, and a weakening of the old Memphite centre. The Pyramid Age ends, then, not because Egyptians forget their gods, lose their skills, or abandon their fields. It ends because the system that once connected gods, skills, fields, officials, floodwater, and royal command no longer holds together at the same scale. The monuments survive, but the political energy that created them changes form. The centre cannot absorb every shock. The provinces cannot be treated as passive extensions of Memphis. The Nile cannot be assumed to renew abundance on command. The king cannot remain the unquestioned centre of practical life simply because ideology says he is the centre of the cosmos. By the time the old order gives way, the transformation has already been underway for generations. The fall is not a single crash echoing through the desert. It is a long weakening, a narrowing of surplus, a redistribution of authority, a crisis of confidence, and a slow discovery that stone can outlast the institutions that raised it. The Pyramid Age ends not with the pyramids falling, but with their meaning changing. They remain on the horizon, immense and silent, while the living country around them begins to organize itself differently. When the old centre weakens, maps do not break all at once. The river still runs north. The deserts still press in from both sides. Memphis still exists, and the ancient cemeteries of kings still stand near the edge of cultivation. but political geography changes in a quieter and more dangerous way. The lines of loyalty become uncertain. The name of a king may be known in one region and meaningless in another. A local ruler may honour older traditions while acting with practical independence. A court may claim the two lands while controlling only part of them. Egypt does not become empty, it becomes divided, and division is especially unsettling in a civilization that has spent centuries imagining unity as the natural shape of order. The period after the Old Kingdom is usually called the First Intermediate Period, a modern label for an ancient reality that is still difficult to reconstruct cleanly. It is not a neat chapter with a single beginning and end visible to everyone at the time. It is a stretch of political fragmentation, regional competition, shifting dynasties, and uneven evidence. Later Egyptian tradition often remembers it as a time of disorder between great ages of kingship. But later tradition has its own agenda. Rulers who reunify Egypt want the broken past to look darker, because their restoration then looks brighter. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how chaotic the period truly was in different regions. Yet the old certainty of unified Memphite power clearly fades. Egypt's map becomes a field of competing claims. After the late 6th dynasty, the royal sequence becomes shadowy. Some king lists preserve names of rulers assigned to the 7th and 8th dynasties, but many are obscure, brief, or poorly attested. The old image of a long-lasting royal house ruling confidently from the Memphite region gives way to something more fragile. Kings may have ruled for short periods, some may have held limited authority, others may be known only through damaged records, later compilations, or fragmentary traces. This uncertainty is itself part of the historical meaning. In the Pyramid Age at its height, the king's name is meant to define time. Royal reigns order the world. When the sequence of kings becomes hard to follow, it suggests not only a problem for modern chronology, but a deeper ancient weakening of royal visibility. At the same time, new centres of power rise. Heracleopolis, in northern Middle Egypt, becomes associated with kings who claim authority over much of the north. Thebes, farther south, grows from a regional centre into a rival force that will eventually reshape Egyptian history. Between them lies a country of nomes, local families, shifting alliances, and contested borders. This is not a simple north versus south story at first, though later memory often sharpens it into that shape. Power is layered. A local governor may acknowledge a king at Heracleopolis while maintaining strong regional autonomy. Another may support Thebes. Some areas may change allegiance as circumstances shift. The river becomes not only a route of unity, but a line along which rivalry travels. The rise of Heracleopolis is important because it shows that the old Memphite world does not vanish instantly. Northern authority still has weight. The administrative traditions of the Old Kingdom do not disappear overnight. Rulers connected with Heracleopolis inherit parts of the older political language and try to claim kingship in a landscape where kingship itself is contested. They may control access to key agricultural regions and routes. They may present themselves as restorers or defenders of order. But their power is not the old effortless supremacy of the pyramid builders. It must be defended against other centres, negotiated through local elites, and measured against the growing strength of Thebes. Thebes, at first, is not the inevitable future capital of Egypt. Its rise is not obvious from the viewpoint of the 4th dynasty pyramids. It is far to the south, in a region whose later importance can make its earlier position seem more destined than it really was. What survives in the record suggests a gradual accumulation of power by Theban rulers who learn to turn local strength into wider ambition. They build alliances, develop military capacity, claim legitimacy, and present themselves as protectors of order in a divided land. Over time, Theban leaders no longer behave as merely regional figures. They become kings in all but uncontested fact, and eventually in full claim. The road to reunification begins not with a sudden miracle, but with regional power learning to speak the language of national restoration. The phrase rival kings can make the period sound like pure war, but the reality is probably more varied. There are certainly conflicts, campaigns, and struggles for territory. Tomb inscriptions and later traditions point to military activity and rivalry, especially as Theban and Heracleopolitan interest collide. Yet political fragmentation also includes diplomacy, local administration, economic adjustment, and ordinary continuity. Fields do not stop needing cultivation because kings argue. Temples do not automatically close because dynasties compete. Craftsmen continue to work, officials continue to govern, communities continue to navigate the demands of whoever can protect, tax, feed, or command them. The first intermediate period is a political crisis, but it is also a world in which life adapts to the absence of a single unquestioned center. This is one reason the old idea of a complete Dark Age has become harder to sustain. Some older narratives pictured the period as a collapse into misery after the glory of the pyramids, followed by rescue under the Middle Kingdom. There is some truth in the memory of disorder, especially from the viewpoint of centralized royal ideology. But archaeology often reveals a more complex landscape. In some provinces, local culture flourishes, regional tombs become important, artistic styles vary more. Local rulers invest in their own monuments and identities. The weakening of the center can create suffering and instability, but it can also allow local elites to express themselves in ways previously overshadowed by royal power. Collapse at the top can look like opportunity in some places below it. Still, fragmentation carries danger. When authority is divided, resources are harder to coordinate across the whole country. A low flood in one region may not be balanced by help from another if political trust has broken down. Trade and transport may become more uncertain where rival powers control routes. Local rulers may compete for grain, labor, territory, and prestige. The idea of Egypt as one ordered body becomes harder to sustain when different kings claim the right to embody that order. This is where the broken map becomes more than a political inconvenience. It becomes a challenge to the deepest Egyptian understanding of reality. The two lands are meant to be joined. When they are not, history itself feels out of alignment. And yet, the divided age preserves something the Old Kingdom could not. It reveals that Egypt is more than its pyramid-building court. The country's resilience lies partly in its provinces, its local institutions, its agricultural routines, and its ability to reorganize around new centers. The fall of the Pyramid Age does not erase Egyptian civilization. It exposes the many layers that had always supported it. Memphis had made these layers serve a grand central vision. In the first intermediate period, those layers become visible on their own terms. The map is broken, but the pieces are alive. From the ruins of unified kingship, a different Egypt begins to form. Heracleopolis and Thebes stand as rival answers to the same question: who can restore order when the old royal world has lost its grip? The answer is not yet settled. The monuments of the Pyramid Age still dominate the northern horizon, but the future is moving southward through local ambition, river politics, and the long struggle to make the two lands one again. Egypt has not ended. It has entered a dangerous middle passage where the memory of eternal kingship survives. but no single king can yet make the whole country believe in it. Beyond the royal court, the end of the Pyramid Age looks less like a single collapse and more like a change in the scale of daily life. The king may no longer command the whole country with the same force, but fields still need ploughing, canals still need clearing, animals still need tending, pottery still needs shaping, boats still need repair, and the dead still need offerings. A broken political map does not suspend the ordinary demands of existence. It brings them closer. When Memphis weakens and rival centers rise, people do not live inside the abstract phrase First Intermediate Period. They live inside villages, estates, workshops, temple communities, and provincial towns where authority is measured by who can organize labor, settle disputes, maintain storage, and keep the rhythms of life from slipping too far into uncertainty. For farmers, the horizon of power is often local even when the ideology of kingship is national. The pharaoh may be the sacred lord of the two lands, but the person who arrives to measure fields, assess obligations, organize canal work, or collect grain is usually an official closer to home. In times of strong central rule, that official represents the crown. In times of fragmentation, the same figure may represent a provincial ruler, a powerful household, a temple estate, or a local administration whose loyalty to a distant king is more ceremonial than practical. The work of agriculture does not become simpler because royal authority weakens. It may become more complicated. Communities have to respond to demands from nearer powers, and those powers may compete, shift, or claim legitimacy in the name of order. The Nile still governs the agricultural year, but the social meaning of the flood changes when central redistribution becomes less reliable. A village that once expected the state to coordinate broader movement of grain may depend more heavily on local storehouses and local patrons. A canal neglected by a distant administration may become the responsibility of regional officials whose reputations rise or fall with their ability to keep water moving. The evidence remains incomplete. Because ordinary farmers rarely leave texts in their own voices, but the structure of Egyptian life makes the stakes clear. Survival depends on predictable labor, shared maintenance, and access to stored food. In a divided country, these needs do not disappear, they become the foundation of local politics. Craftsmen occupy another important place in this changing world. The Old Kingdom's great royal projects had concentrated many specialized skills around the pyramid machine stone cutting, carpentry, metalwork, pottery, baking, brewing, weaving, boat building, and artistic production. When royal construction declines in scale, those skills do not vanish. They are redirected. Provincial tombs, local temples, elite households, and regional courts become more important patrons. The result is not simply artistic decline, though older histories often described it that way. It is variation. Local styles become more visible. Some works may lack the polish of royal workshops, while others show vitality, inventiveness, and strong regional identity. The weakening of a central court can reduce standardization, but it can also reveal hands and traditions that were previously overshadowed. Pottery is especially revealing because it belongs so closely to daily life. A pyramid may proclaim kingship, but a jar records habit. Vessels carry grain, beer, oil, water, and offerings. They move through kitchens, storerooms, tombs, work sites, and temples. Changes in pottery forms, production methods, and distribution patterns can show how communities adapt when political networks shift. A humble vessel may suggest whether goods are moving widely or being produced locally, whether older systems of provisioning continue or fragment, whether a household participates in broader exchange or depends more on nearby resources. These traces are not dramatic, but they are among the most faithful witnesses to life beyond the court. They show a society continuing to make, store, consume, and remember. Priests and temple personnel also live through the transition. Temples are not only religious buildings, they're economic and social institutions. They hold land, receive offerings, employ workers, preserve ritual knowledge, and connect communities to gods, ancestors, and local identity. In the Old Kingdom, royal ideology gives the king a central role in maintaining cosmic order, but local cults have their own roots. As central power weakens, local temples may become even more important as places of continuity. A ritual performed in a provincial shrine can reassure a community that order still exists, even if national kingship is contested. Scholars still debate the exact role of temples in every region during this period, but it is clear that religion does not stop at the edge of royal power. It adapts, localizes, and survives. For local elites, the Troubled Age offers both danger and opportunity. A powerful family rooted in a nome can present itself as protector, provider, judge, and sponsor of ritual life. Its tomb can show abundance, its inscriptions can claim generosity, its estates can support dependence. Such families may still use the language of loyalty to a king, but their real strength comes from regional control. In some cases, they may become the practical rulers of their districts. Their legitimacy rests on a different balance than that of Old Kingdom pharaohs. It is less about building a monument visible to the whole world, and more about sustaining a local world convincingly enough that people accept their authority. This does not mean life is peaceful everywhere. Fragmentation can bring insecurity, rivalry, and shifting obligations. Boundaries between competing powers may harden. Local leaders may demand labor or supplies for defense, tomb building, temple service, or political competition. Some communities may face scarcity more sharply than others, yet it would be misleading to imagine ordinary Egypt as only a landscape of despair. People continue to marry, work, worship, bury their dead, repair homes, exchange goods, and teach skills. The deep routines of the Nile Valley have a resilience that outlasts dynasties. A state may collapse at the center while life continues in modified forms along the riverbanks. This resilience is one of the most important lessons of the First Intermediate Period. The Old Kingdom's fall is real, but it is not the same as cultural extinction. Egypt's people do not forget how to farm, carve, write, pray, or govern. They reorganize around nearer structures of authority. A provincial court can become a small center of culture. A local cemetery can become a stage for memory. A temple can preserve sacred rhythm. A workshop can carry techniques forward. A storehouse can become more politically important than a distant royal name. What changes is the scale at which order is experienced. The Great Pyramid state had gathered Egypt into a single overwhelming symbolic system. The divided age breaks that system into smaller worlds, each trying to preserve enough order to endure. There is something deeply human in this. Civilizations are often remembered by their greatest monuments, but they survive through ordinary competence. Someone must know when to plant. Someone must keep accounts. Someone must shape a jar that will not crack in firing. Someone must repair a boat before the river journey. Someone must remember the correct words for a ritual. Someone must manage a storehouse without emptying it too soon. These acts do not look like history from far away, but they are the texture of survival. The royal court may provide the grand story, Yet the country continues because thousands of smaller stories continue beneath it. By looking beyond the palace, the fall of the Pyramid Age becomes less simple and more profound. It is not only the failure of kingship, it is the exposure of everything kingship had depended upon. Farmers, craftsmen, priests, scribes, boatmen, estate workers, and local elites had always been part of the Old Kingdom's strength. When the centre weakens, their world does not disappear, it becomes more visible. The pyramids still stand in the north, but the life of Egypt has widened beyond them. In the broken map of the first intermediate period, ordinary routines and local ambitions carry the civilization forward, not as the old pyramid state, but as something more regional, more varied, and still unmistakably Egyptian. Memory is never a passive storehouse. It chooses, reshapes, sharpens, softens, hides, and exaggerates. By the time later Egyptians look back on the end of the Old Kingdom, the crisis has already become more than a sequence of political and environmental difficulties. It has become a warning. It is remembered as the kind of age that proves why order matters, why kingship must be strong, why the land must not be allowed to fracture, and why the world without proper rule can seem to turn against itself. This is one of the most difficult parts of the Pyramid Age's ending, because the past reaches us not only through what happened, but through what later people needed it to mean. Famine is central to that memory, but famine in Egyptian historical imagination is rarely only about hunger. It is about the failure of balance. A low flood can become a moral sign. Empty fields can become evidence of cosmic disorder. People in need can become proof that authority has weakened. In a world where the king's role is tied to maintaining order between gods, nature, and society, scarcity does not remain a private hardship. It becomes a political accusation, even when no one says it directly. If the land cannot feed itself, then something has gone wrong not only in the fields, but in the structure of the world. Later texts draw power from this connection. They remember or imagine hunger as part of a wider unravelling, where social ranks blur, temples suffer, officials lose command, and certainty drains from life. Yet these memories must be handled carefully. Later Egyptian literary works are not simple eyewitness accounts of the Old Kingdom collapse. They're composed in particular contexts, copied by scribes, shaped by elite concerns, and often designed to contrast disorder with restoration. A text that describes chaos may tell us as much about later ideas of good kingship as it tells us about the actual conditions of an earlier crisis. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far these works preserve genuine memories of first intermediate period hardship. But even when they exaggerate, they are valuable. Exaggeration itself has a history. It shows what kind of fear later Egyptians found believable. The most famous images of disorder in Egyptian literature often work through reversal. The poor appear rich, the rich appear poor, servants behave like masters, masters lose security, the land is unsettled, tombs are vulnerable, and the proper channels of authority no longer function. This is not random drama. It is the literary language of a society that believes order is something actively maintained. To describe the world upside down is to describe a universe in which the bonds of kingship, ritual, hierarchy, and provision have weakened. Such texts do not need to give accurate weather records or tax statistics to preserve the emotional shape of collapse. They show that Egyptians imagined political breakdown as a total disturbance of the known world. Rulers who came after the crisis had strong reasons to use that memory. A king who claims to restore unity benefits from a past described as broken. The darker the age before him, the brighter his own rule appears, This is not unique to Egypt. States often define legitimacy by contrasting themselves with disorder. But in Egypt, the contrast carries special force because kingship is tied to cosmic order. A reunifying ruler is not merely a successful politician. He presents himself as the one who makes Egypt whole again, who restores offerings, secures fields, protects temples, reopens routes, and returns the two lands to their proper condition. The memory of famine and chaos becomes a political tool, a shadow cast behind the throne so that the restored king stands in stronger light. This is where propaganda enters the story, though the word must be used with care. Ancient royal ideology is not propaganda in the modern narrow sense of cynical messaging detached from belief. Egyptian rulers and their scribes may sincerely believe that strong kingship is necessary for the world to function, but sincerity does not make political memory neutral. Later accounts can preserve real trauma while arranging it into a lesson useful to power. The first intermediate period can become the negative image of kingship, a vision of what happens when central authority fails. The Middle Kingdom, in turn, can present itself as recovery, wisdom, and renewed balance. History becomes a moral landscape. The danger for modern storytelling is to accept this ancient framing too easily. If later sources say the land was in chaos, it is tempting to imagine universal collapse everywhere. If they describe hunger, it is tempting to imagine uninterrupted famine across all Egypt. If they praise a restoring king, it is tempting to assume everything before him was failure. But archaeology complicates the picture. Some regions show continuity. Local elites build and inscribe. Communities adapt. Artistic traditions diversify. Provincial identities strengthen. The world after the Old Kingdom is troubled, but not empty. It is fragmented, not erased. The memory of disorder is powerful because it contains truth, but that truth is filtered through political need and literary form. Famine itself may have varied sharply from place to place. Egypt is long, and the Nile does not affect every district in identical ways. Local storage, access to canals, the strength of regional leadership, and the timing of particular floods could all change the experience of shortage. One community might remember scarcity as a defining wound, while another experiences the same broader period as difficult but manageable. A provincial official who claims to have fed people during hardship may be boasting. But the boast makes sense because such actions were meaningful. It suggests that in times of stress, the provider becomes the legitimate authority. Later kings absorb that same idea on a national scale. The true ruler is the one who feeds Egypt, restores abundance, and turns fear back into order. There is a lesser-known subtlety in these memories. They're not only about physical survival, they're also about the survival of ritual. In Egyptian thought, temples, offerings, tombs, and proper ceremonies help maintain the relationship between the living, the dead, and the divine. A period of scarcity threatens these relationships. If offerings decline, if tombs are neglected, if priests lack support, then the crisis extends beyond the harvest. The dead may be forgotten. Gods may be underserved, and the chain of continuity may feel weakened. Later descriptions of disorder often include this sacred anxiety. Hunger is terrible, but a world in which rituals fail is more than hungry. It is spiritually unstable. This helps explain why the pyramids remain so haunting after the Old Kingdom ends. They are monuments of a system that promised eternal maintenance. Yet the crisis raises the possibility that even eternity requires supplies. A dead king's cult needs living people to bring offerings. A tomb needs memory. A temple needs land and labor. If the state fragments, if granaries shrink, if local priorities shift, then the afterlife economy of earlier rulers becomes harder to sustain. The pyramid still stands, but the rituals around it may weaken. Stone lasts longer than obligation. By the time Egypt moves toward reunification, the memory of famine and disorder has become part of the foundation for a new political imagination. Later rulers do not simply rebuild the old kingdom as it was. They inherit its grandeur, but also its warning. They know, or believe they know, that central power can fail, that provinces can grow strong, that floods can test the throne, and that legitimacy must be made visible in care, justice, and provision. The fall of the Pyramid Age becomes a lesson told in the language of hunger, chaos, and restoration. It is not pure history, and it is not pure invention. It is memory doing what memory often does after catastrophe, preserving pain, arranging blame, and turning survival into a story that future power can use. The road out of the first intermediate period does not begin with Egypt suddenly remembering how to be united. It begins more quietly, in the south, where local power hardens into ambition, and ambition slowly learns to speak as destiny. Thebes, which will one day become one of the most famous cities in the ancient world, is not born as the obvious heir to the pyramid builders. It does not possess the ancient royal weight of Memphis. It does not stand beside the great 4th Dynasty monuments. It is a regional centre in Upper Egypt, tied to local gods, local families, local roots, and the long river corridor that connects the south to the rest of the country. Yet in the broken political landscape after the Old Kingdom, places that once seemed secondary can become decisive. When the old centre loses its grip, the future often rises from the edge. The Theban rise is important because it shows that Egyptian reunification was not simply a restoration of the past. It was a new political process built from regional foundations. The rulers of Thebes had to expand authority step by step, turning local legitimacy into wider command. They had to control territory, secure resources, build alliances, face rivals, and present their actions as the return of order rather than merely the success of one ambitious province. This distinction mattered. A local warlord could win battles, but a king of Egypt had to claim something larger. He had to say, in effect, that his rule did not merely serve Thebes, it served the two lands, it healed the fracture, it restored the proper shape of the world. At first, Theban power grows inside a competitive field. Heracleopolis remains a major rival in the north, associated with kings who also claim legitimate rule. Between the two lie territories whose loyalties may shift, whose officials may calculate advantage, and whose resources matter to both sides. The struggle is not only ideological, it is geographical and economic. Control of the Nile Valley means control of movement, harvests, labor, communication, and symbolic access to the body of Egypt itself. A ruler who cannot move along the river cannot truly claim the land. A ruler who cannot command grain cannot sustain troops, officials, temples, or administration. Reunification is therefore not achieved by royal language alone. It requires the practical rebuilding of reach. The Theban rulers of the 11th dynasty become central to this process. Their names and exact political relationships can be difficult for modern readers because they belong to a period where evidence is uneven, but their broad historical role is clear. They push Theban authority beyond local borders and into a wider contest for Egypt. The repeated royal name in Tef appears in this southern rise, associated with rulers who strengthen Theban identity and begin to claim broader status. Their monuments and inscriptions show a political culture that is no longer content with provincial importance. Thebes is learning to imagine itself as the centre from which Egypt can be remade. This is not a clean ascent. It is a world of rivalry, campaign, negotiation, and memory shaped afterward by the winners. Scholars still debate the details of the conflict between Theban and Heracleopolitan powers, partly because surviving evidence is fragmentary and often ideological. Later sources tend to smooth complexity into a story of disorder followed by restoration. But the process must have been uneven. Local elites did not simply abandon their interest because a Theban ruler claimed destiny. Some would have resisted, others would have joined. Some regions may have preferred a distant king if he interfered less with local authority. Others may have wanted stronger protection or more predictable order. Reunification was not only a military victory, it was a political persuasion carried through force, reward, ritual, and administration. The figure who eventually stands at the threshold of reunification is Mentuhotep II. His reign marks one of the great turning points in Egyptian history, not because he returns Egypt exactly to the Old Kingdom, but because he succeeds in creating a new united monarchy after generations of fragmentation. His power grows from Thebes, but his claim reaches beyond Thebes. He becomes the ruler who can be remembered as rejoining the two lands, overcoming rivals, and laying the foundation for what modern historians call the Middle Kingdom. In Egyptian terms, this is more than a dynastic change. It is the reassertion of cosmic and political unity after a time remembered as broken. Mentuhotep II's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri captures the New Age's character. It is not a pyramid in the Old Kingdom style, standing on the Memphite plateau as a geometric mountain of centralized power. It is built into the dramatic western cliffs of Thebes, where the desert rises behind the Nile in steep walls of stone. The setting itself speaks differently. It fuses royal memory with a local sacred landscape that will become increasingly important in later Egyptian history. The architecture has been debated, reconstructed, and interpreted in different ways, and the evidence does not allow every detail to be known with certainty, but its meaning as a statement of renewed kingship is unmistakable. The reunified monarchy is not simply copying the old pyramid age. It is inventing a new visual language for power. This matters because the Middle Kingdom that follows is deeply shaped by the memory of collapse. The rulers who rebuild centralized authority inherit the Old Kingdom's ideals, but they also inherit its warning. They know that provincial elites can become strong. They know that local administration cannot be ignored. They know that royal legitimacy must be expressed not only through monumental death, but through justice, provision, military control, temple building, and administrative integration. The Middle Kingdom becomes famous for a different kind of royal self-presentation, often more reflective, more concerned with the burdens of rule, and more attentive to the fragility of order. Whether every text preserves actual royal thought is debated, but the tone of the age suggests a monarchy that understands danger in ways the early pyramid builders may not have needed to articulate. The reunification also changes the balance of Egyptian geography. Memphis and the northern royal cemeteries do not lose all importance, but Thebes has now entered the deepest current of Egyptian history. A southern city, once outside the main pyramid landscape, becomes a source of national kingship. This shift is one of the most striking consequences of the Old Kingdom's fall. Power has moved, fractured, and returned in altered form. The state that emerges is still Egyptian, still royal, still sacred, still tied to the Nile and the two lands, but it has been remade by the provinces that survived the centre's weakening. There is an irony in the Theban road to reunification. The same decentralization that helped unravel the Old Kingdom also made possible the rise of new power strong enough to reunite the country. Provincial authority was not merely a symptom of decay. It was also a reservoir of resilience. Thebes could rise because Egypt's local structures had not disappeared. They had endured, competed, adapted, and gathered strength. The old pyramid state collapsed at the center, but the skills of government, ritual, agriculture, and elite organization continued elsewhere. When reunification came, it drew from those surviving structures. The end of the Pyramid Age therefore leads not into nothingness, but into transformation. Thebes does not erase the memory of Giza. It adds another layer to Egyptian time. The Great Pyramids remain as ancestors of kingship, but they no longer define the only possible form of royal greatness. The Middle Kingdom will look back, learn, borrow, warn, and revise. It will build its own monuments, write its own political wisdom, and remember the broken age as the darkness from which restored order emerged. In that memory, Thebes becomes the road back to unity. Yet the unity it creates is not innocent. It carries the knowledge that Egypt has already fractured once, and that even the most sacred order must be maintained in the real world of grain, rivers, officials, ambition, and time. What really ended the Pyramid Age is not a single answer hidden behind the stones. It is a pattern, and patterns are harder to see because they do not announce themselves like disasters. A drought can be imagined. A rebellion can be imagined. An old king dying after a long reign can be imagined. A hungry province refusing the authority of Memphis can be imagined. Each of these has the satisfying shape of a cause, but the end of the Old Kingdom resists that simplicity. It is not a story of climate instead of politics, or politics instead of economics, or economics instead of belief. It is a story of a state built on many forms of balance, losing too many of them at once. Climate remains one of the strongest pressures in the story, but it must be handled with care. There is evidence that the late 3rd millennium BCE brought aridity and disruption across parts of northeast Africa and Western Asia, and Egypt may have experienced repeated low Nile floods or reduced river reliability. Such conditions would have struck directly at the agricultural surplus that made royal power practical. Yet scholars still debate the timing, intensity, and regional expression of this climatic stress. The so-called 4.2 kilo-year event was not a single uniform hammer blow falling equally across the ancient world. In Egypt, the Nile's behavior mattered more than any abstract global label. A sequence of poor floods could narrow harvests, weaken redistribution, and make the sacred promise of kingship harder to fulfill. But climate did not walk into Memphis and dismiss the 6th dynasty by itself. It created pressure. Human systems determined how much damage that pressure could do. Decentralization is the second great force. Over generations, provincial officials became more visible, more rooted, and more capable of acting as local powers. This did not begin as rebellion. It began as administration. The Old Kingdom needed local officials to manage a long and varied country. It needed men who could count grain, organize labor, supervise canals, command storehouses, and represent royal order in distant nomes. In times of strength, such men extended the king's reach. In times of weakness, they became alternative centers of authority. The same system that made Egypt governable also made it vulnerable to regional independence. By the end of the Old Kingdom, power had not disappeared. It had spread outward, and once spread, it was difficult to pull back into one royal hand. Economic burden adds another layer. The pyramid projects themselves are often blamed too quickly, as if the old kingdom simply exhausted itself dragging blocks until nothing remained. That is too crude. Egypt's greatest pyramids were built centuries before the final collapse, and the state continued to function long after the largest monuments were complete. But the royal mortuary economy did create lasting obligations. Dead kings needed cults. Cults needed land, offerings, priests, storage, administration, and labor. Elite tombs and local institutions added further claims. The sacred economy of memory tied resources to the past. In prosperity, this made kingship feel eternal. Under stress, it reduced flexibility. A state that must feed both the living and an expanding world of the honored dead carries a heavy inheritance. Succession problems also matter, especially around and after Pepi II. A very long reign may have provided decades of surface stability while allowing officials to entrench themselves and royal succession to grow more delicate. After such a reign, a series of weaker or shorter-lived kings could struggle to reassert control. Later king lists preserve an uncertain and fragmented sequence, suggesting that kingship itself became less visible, less stable, or less widely recognized. Yet succession alone does not fully explain the collapse either. Many ancient states survive difficult successions when their economy is strong, their elites are loyal, and their environment is favorable. In Egypt's case, succession uncertainty became dangerous because it unfolded in a landscape already strained by local power, resource pressure, and possible environmental instability. Ideology is the layer that makes all the others more consequential. The Old Kingdom did not present the pharaoh as a merely practical ruler. It presented him as the living center of order. This gave kingship enormous strength when the system worked. The king's authority was confirmed by the flood, the harvest, the offerings, the functioning bureaucracy, and the monumental landscape of pyramids. But the same ideology could become fragile when reality failed to match it. If floods were poor, if granaries were strained, if local officials fed communities more effectively than the royal center, then the king's cosmic role became harder to experience in daily life. Belief does not vanish suddenly, but it can lose its practical force. A sacred king who cannot organize abundance is still sacred in theory, but in the village, theory does not fill a basket. The limits of administration tie the whole problem together. The Old Kingdom was remarkably organized, but it was not infinitely capable. It depended on transport along the Nile, accurate records, loyal officials, predictable harvests, and the ability to convert local production into national projects. It could not instantly overcome repeated environmental shocks. It could not easily prevent powerful local families from becoming indispensable. It could not maintain every past obligation without cost. It could not guarantee smooth succession forever, and it could not command the river. The state's brilliance lay in coordination, but coordination is exactly what becomes difficult when trust, resources, and authority begin to fragment. This is why the end of the Pyramid Age should be understood less as collapse from one cause than as cascading vulnerability. A low flood reduces grain. Reduced grain increases local pressure. Local pressure strengthens provincial officials who control storage. Stronger provincial officials weaken the center's ability to redistribute resources. A weaker center struggles to maintain royal projects and cults. Strained ideology makes kingship less convincing. Succession uncertainty then enters a system already losing coherence. Each pressure amplifies the others. None needs to destroy Egypt alone. Together, they make the old model unsustainable. There is no need to imagine Egyptians as passive victims of catastrophe. They adapted constantly. Provincial communities reorganized. Local elites maintained order. Theban rulers eventually rebuilt unity. The civilization survived because its foundations were deeper than one dynasty. But the specific form of the Old Kingdom, the great Memphite pyramid state, could not continue unchanged. Its monuments were too closely tied to a political and economic structure that depended on wide surplus. Strong central command and the symbolic concentration of power in the king's body and tomb. When that structure weakened, the pyramid remained, but the age that made the pyramid the supreme expression of kingship faded. The answer, then, is not that drought ended the Old Kingdom, or nomarchs ended it, or Pepi II ended it, or pyramids ended it. The answer is that Egypt's first great centralized state reached the limits of the world it had built. It had transformed river mud into stone eternity, but it could not transform uncertainty into permanent control. The Pyramid Age ended because nature, administration, elite ambition, royal obligation, and sacred expectation all pressed against one another until the centre could no longer hold the same weight. The wonder is not that it fell. The wonder is that such a delicate balance produced monuments so enduring that, thousands of years later, the stones still make the system behind them look stronger than any human system can truly be. The ruins of the Pyramid Age still speak, but they do not speak in the simple voice people often expect from monuments. They do not say only that Egypt was powerful, or that kings were ambitious, or that ancient builders could master stone at a scale that still unsettles the modern imagination. They say something more complicated. They speak of a society that learned to organize the natural world, human labor, sacred belief, and political command into one extraordinary system, and they speak of the limits of that system. The pyramids are not only proofs of success, they are also reminders that success can become a burden, that grandeur can hide dependence, and that the most permanent-looking achievements may rest on conditions as fragile as water rising at the right time. At Giza, the Great Pyramids seem to float above history. Their scale is so overwhelming that they can make everything after them feel smaller, as if the Old Kingdom reached a height from which Egypt could only decline. But that impression is partly an illusion created by survival. Stone preserves royal ambition better than mud brick preserves ordinary life. A pyramid remains visible when villages vanish, when administrative buildings dissolve back into the floodplain, when wooden tools decay, when baskets and ropes disappear, when the bodies of officials and workers become fragmentary traces in cemeteries. The monuments dominate because they endured. Yet the world that built them was always broader than the stones. It included scribes bending over accounts, farmers reading the soil after the flood, boat crews waiting for the right water level, quarrymen cutting into cliffs, priests maintaining offerings, and provincial officials turning royal ideology into local administration. The end of the Old Kingdom changes how those monuments are understood. During the Pyramid Age, a royal tomb is a living centre of ritual power. It is meant to keep the king's presence active after death. It gathers offerings, land, personnel, and memory. After the state weakens, the pyramid remains, but its living network becomes harder to sustain. This is one of the quietest and most striking facts about ancient monuments. They can outlive the institutions that gave them meaning. A pyramid may continue to stand for thousands of years, but the priests assigned to it, the estates that fed it, the storehouses that supplied it, and the political world that honoured it can all change or disappear. Stone is durable. Obligation is not. This does not mean the Old Kingdom becomes irrelevant after its fall. Quite the opposite. It becomes a memory so powerful that later Egyptians keep returning to it. The Pyramid Age becomes an ancestral age of kingship, a time of great rulers, sacred architecture, and divine order. Later kings may not rebuild the exact same world, but they inherit its prestige. They look back to it, borrow from it, imitate it, reinterpret it, and sometimes measure themselves against it. The Middle Kingdom, rising after fragmentation, does not erase the Old Kingdom. It transforms the lesson. It understands that unity must be actively maintained, that provinces must be managed, that justice and provision matter, and that kingship must prove itself not only in death, but in the living administration of the land. The legacy of the collapse is therefore double. On one hand, it shows the vulnerability of centralized power. A state can be sacred, old, organized, and monumental, yet still depend on environmental regularity, elite cooperation, economic flexibility, and credible leadership. On the other hand, it shows the resilience of Egyptian civilization. The Old Kingdom falls, but Egypt does not vanish. The language continues, ritual continues, agriculture continues, local government continues. Artistic traditions continue, though they change. The idea of the two lands survives even when the two lands are politically divided. The collapse of the pyramid state becomes a rupture, but not an ending. It is a passage through which Egypt emerges altered, wounded, more regionally aware, and eventually capable of rebuilding unity in a new form. This is why the question of what ended the Pyramid Age still matters. It is not only an Egyptian question, it is a human question about the relationship between ambition and support. Every complex society depends on invisible systems beneath visible achievements. The Old Kingdom's visible achievement was the pyramid. Its invisible systems were the flood regime, agricultural surplus, administrative records, transport routes, elite loyalty, ritual economy, and belief in royal order. When those systems aligned, Egypt built monuments that seem almost impossible. When those systems strained, the monuments could not save the state that had made them. The pyramids stood, but they could not collect grain, resolve succession, restrain local ambition, or summon a better Nile flood. A lesser known but important lesson lies in the provinces. For a long time, the story of ancient Egypt was told mostly through kings, capitals, and monuments. The end of the Old Kingdom forces the eye outward. It reveals local cemeteries, regional officials, small centers of power, and communities that carried Egyptian culture through the weakening of the court. In this sense, the collapse makes Egypt more visible, not less. It shows that civilization is not held only at the top. It is distributed through habits, skills, institutions, landscapes, and memories. The palace may fail to command the whole, but people along the river still know how to live in Egypt. They know the fields, the gods, the seasons, the tools, the routes, and the language of order. The state breaks, the civilization adapts. Scholars still debate the exact balance of causes, and the evidence remains incomplete. There will likely never be one final inscription that answers everything. The Nile's behavior must be reconstructed from indirect traces. The political sequence after Pepi II remains difficult. Later memories of famine and disorder must be separated carefully from literary shaping and royal propaganda. Provincial tombs tell us what elites wanted remembered, not everything that happened. Yet uncertainty does not mean ignorance. The pattern is strong enough to see environmental pressure, decentralization, economic obligations, succession problems, and ideological strain converged until the old Memphite pyramid state could no longer function as it once had. The ruins that still speak, then, do not speak only of death. They speak of transformation. They show how an age can end while its civilization continues. They show how a political system can fail without erasing the people who lived within it. They show how later generations can turn collapse into memory, memory into warning, and warning into new forms of power. The old kingdom built as though eternity could be engineered from stone. Its fall revealed that eternity, in human affairs, is never engineered once and for all. It must be renewed in every flood, every harvest, every act of administration, every transfer of authority, every promise that the world will remain in balance. And still, the pyramids remain. Their silence is not empty. It is filled with the labour of a vanished system and the questions left behind by its ending. They stand at the edge of the desert like the last witnesses of a state that dreamed in stone, ruled through sacred order, and discovered, as every society eventually does, that even the greatest monuments cannot hold back change forever. The sun lowers over the western desert, and the pyramids grow darker against the fading sky. Their edges soften. The heat leaves the stones. The long lines of shadow move slowly across the sand, covering the causeways, the ruined temples, the broken walls, and the old paths where workers, priests, officials, and mourners once passed. Nothing moves quickly here now. The kingdom that built this landscape has been gone for thousands of years, but its shape remains, quiet and immense, as if the earth itself has remembered where power once stood. The end of the Pyramid Age is not a story of disappearance into nothing. It is a story of change, and change is often quieter than destruction. The Nile still flowed after the Old Kingdom. Fields still turned green. Boats still moved along the river. People still buried their dead, spoke to their gods, measured grain, repaired canals, and watched the sky for signs of another season. Egypt continued, but the old certainty had been broken. The age of the greatest pyramids passed into memory. A memory made it larger, stranger, and more distant. There is something gentle and unsettling in that survival. A civilization can lose its centre and still carry its songs forward. A monument can lose its rituals and still hold the light. A name can fade from administration and remain in stone. Human stories are fragile because they depend on voices, bodies, food, trust, and time. Yet they are also stubborn. They cling to walls, tools, bones, pottery, river mud, and the places where people once believed their world would last forever. The Old Kingdom wanted eternity. It built for eternity. But what it left behind is not perfect permanence. It is a message shaped by loss. It tells us that every order, however grand, rests on living things, water that must return, grain that must grow, hands that must work, leaders who must be believed, communities that must endure. When those things falter, even stone cannot keep an age from ending. And so the pyramids remain under the desert sky, not as answers, but as witnesses. They watch the Nile Valley from the edge of life and sand. They hold the memory of kings, workers, floods, hunger, ambition, restoration, and time. As evening settles, they seem less like monuments to certainty and more like quiet markers of a deeper truth that civilizations rise by turning the fragile into the magnificent, and they fall when the fragile can no longer bear the weight.